Beneath the scorching desert sun, they left him to die. A 12-year-old boy, branded useless by his own community, abandoned in a landscape where even the strongest struggle to survive. No food, no water, no hope. But as the merciless heat threatened to claim another victim, something extraordinary appeared on the horizon, a sight that would change his life forever. A magnificent herd of wild horses, moving like spirits across the golden sands, about to forge an unlikely alliance that would become legend. What followed was a journey so remarkable it would be dismissed as myth if there weren't witnesses still alive to tell the tale. How did a starving boy not only survive, but rise to lead one of the most powerful wild horse herds in history? Before we continue this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's chapter will leave you speechless. The clay water jug they left him weighed heavily in Amir's hands, a final mockery of mercy, enough water for 3 days, as if prolonging his death made it more honorable. He watched the caravan disappear into the heat haze, his family's silhouettes dissolving like mirages in the distance. Even his mother hadn't looked back. Useless boy. The words echoed in his mind, spoken in his father's gravelly voice. Can't herd, can't trade, can't even carry water without tripping over his own feet. Each perceived failure had been catalogued, measured, and ultimately deemed too costly for their struggling desert community. Amir's fingers traced the rough surface of the jug, feeling the familiar patterns he'd watched his sister press into the clay before it dried. She, at least, had cried when the council made their decision, but tears meant nothing against tradition, against the harsh mathematics of survival that ruled their lives. He hadn't always been the clumsy one. Before the fever 2 summers ago, he'd been quick and sure-footed as any child in the village. The sickness had left him with a slight tremor in his hands and an occasional stutter that made him the target of mockery. In a community where every drop of water and morsel of food had to be earned, his newfound awkwardness became an unforgivable burden. The sun climbed higher, and Amir forced himself to move. Standing still meant death in the desert. This much he knew. His feet made shallow impressions in the sand as he walked, each step carrying him further from everything he'd ever known. The water sloshed gently in the jug, a constant reminder of time slipping away. He walked until the sun touched the horizon, his shadow stretching long and thin across the dunes. The tremor in his hands was worse now, exhaustion making his muscles quiver. Still, he didn't stop. In the growing dark, he thought of the stories his grandmother used to tell before she, too, was deemed too burdensome to keep. Tales of desert, spirits and ancient wisdom of those who learned to speak the language of the wind and sand. The desert, she would say, her blind eyes turned toward some distant point. She takes, yes, but she also gives to those who learn to listen. He dismissed these as the ramblings of an old woman then. Now they were all he had to hold on to. Night fell like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that made Amir's teeth chatter. He found shelter in the lee of a dune, wrapping his thin robe tightly around himself. The stars above were brilliant, uncounted diamonds scattered across black silk. He allowed himself a single, precious sip of water. Tomorrow, he would need to find food. Tomorrow, he would need to prove himself either worthy of survival or accept the fate his community had chosen for him. But tonight, curled against the sand that still held traces of the day's warmth, Amir did something he hadn't done since the fever took his strength. He dreamed of a future where being different didn't mean being useless. In the distance, carried on the night wind, came a sound he couldn't quite identify. Not the howl of wolves or the cry of nightbirds, but something else, something that made his heart beat a little faster with recognition, though he'd never heard it before. Dawn painted the desert in shades of rose and gold, waking Amir from fitful dreams. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and a fine coating of sand covered every inch of his skin. The broken compass he'd found in his robe pocket, Another cruel joke from the village boys caught the early light, its cracked face reflecting his own fractured reality. Standing made his head swim. He'd been too afraid to drink much water during the night, and now thirst clawed at his throat. Another tiny sip from the jug. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking, spilling precious drops onto the sand. The sight of wasted water brought tears to his eyes, but he blinked them away. Tears were just another way to lose moisture. His grandmother's voice came to him again. "Watch the beetles in the morning, child. They know where water hides." He'd never paid much attention before, but now he noticed them. Small black forms, moving purposefully across the sand. They seemed to be heading in the same direction, toward a cluster of rocks in the distance. Following the beetles meant walking away from the last signs of his people's passage. But Amir had no choice. The sun was already beginning to show its teeth, and he needed to find shelter before it reached its full strength. His steps were unsteady at first, but as he walked, he found a rhythm that helped control the tremor in his legs. The rock cluster was further than it looked. Everything in the desert was. By the time he reached it, sweat had soaked through his robe despite the morning cool, but his grandmother's wisdom proved true. In the shadow of the largest rock, moisture had condensed overnight. Not much, but enough to dampen the sand. Amir remembered another lesson and pulled off his outer robe, laying it carefully over the damp patch. The fabric would collect the moisture, giving him a few extra precious drops. While waiting for the fabric to do its work, he explored the rocks. In a narrow crevice, he found what the beetles had been seeking, a small colony of desert plants, their thick leaves storing water. His hands shook as he carefully broke off a leaf, but this time it didn't matter. The bitter juice was the sweetest thing he'd ever tasted. As the sun climbed higher, Amir created a small shelter, wedging his robe between rocks to make shade. The physical work was difficult with his unsteady hands, and twice he had to rebuild when the structure collapsed. But with each attempt he learned how to brace the fabric better, how to use smaller stones to secure the edges. In the relative cool of his shelter, Amir found his mind clearing. He wasn't just surviving, he was thinking, planning. The desert plants could be gathered and stored. The beetles would show him where to find more. If he could move from shelter to shelter in the early mornings and late evenings, a sound interrupted his thoughts. The same strange noise he'd heard the night before, clearer now. A rhythmic drumming, like distant thunder, but steady and growing closer. Amir's heart began to race. No one from his tribe would be traveling at this time of day. Bandits wouldn't waste energy in the heat either. Cautiously, he peered out from his shelter. The sight made him forget to breathe. Against the shimmering horizon, dark shapes moved with fluid grace. They appeared and disappeared like spirits, their forms distorted by the heat waves rising from the sand. But as they drew closer, their shapes became clearer, proud heads held high, manes flowing like banners in the wind, hooves striking, the earth in that thunderous rhythm, horses, wild horses moving like water across the desert. Amir had heard stories of them but had never seen them himself. His people believed them to be little more than myths, or at best creatures that kept to the distant mountains. Yet here they were, drawing closer to his hiding place with each powerful stride. As he watched, transfixed, the smallest tremor of hope stirred in his chest. Perhaps the desert wasn't just taking after all. Perhaps, as his grandmother had said, it was also giving. The horses moved like a river of muscle and grace, their coats gleaming golden and brown under the desert sun. Amir pressed himself deeper into the shadow of his shelter, heart pounding against his ribs. He'd never seen anything so magnificent, or so terrifying. The ground trembled beneath their hooves as they approached his cluster of rocks. Leading the herd was a mare the color of storm clouds, her mane whipping in the hot wind like threads of smoke. She moved with the authority of years, each step precise and measured. Behind her came others, young stallions with fire in their steps, older mares keeping watchful eyes on dancing foals, adolescents prancing with barely contained energy. Thus, lead mare suddenly halted, her head lifting high. She'd caught his scent on the wind. Amir held his breath, expecting the herd to wheel away in panic. Instead, the mare turned directly toward his hiding place, nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Her eyes, when they met his, were the deep brown of water-soaked earth. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped closer. The rest of the herd shifted, creating a loose circle around his shelter. Amir remained frozen, remembering his grandmother's words about desert creatures. Move suddenly and you're a predator. Move slowly and you might become family. His hands were trembling worse than ever as he slowly emerged from the shade, keeping his movements fluid despite his fear. The mare watched him with ancient wisdom in her gaze. When he was fully in the open, she did something extraordinary. She lowered her head, blowing soft breath across his face. The gesture brought tears to Amir's eyes. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement, not of weakness or uselessness, but of presence, of being. His shaking fingers found a coarse strand of her mane, and without thinking, he wove it into a small bracelet around his wrist. The mare stood perfectly, still allowing this liberty as if she understood its importance. Other horses began to approach, curiosity overcoming caution. A young foal, dappled like morning shadows, actually bumped against Amir's back, making him stumble. Instead of mocking laughter, he heard soft nickers, almost like gentle laughter, but without cruelty. When he regained his balance, the lead mare pressed her velvet nose against his shoulder, steadying him. They stayed through the worst heat of the day, gathering in the shade of the rocks. Amir watched in wonder as they showed him their own water-finding techniques, pouring at certain types of sand until moisture appeared, seeking out specific plants that held life-giving liquid in their stems. His trembling hands were no barrier to their acceptance. If anything, they seemed to take extra care around him, positioning their bodies so he could steady himself against their solid warmth. As the sun began its descent, Amir faced a choice. The herd was preparing to move on, and the lead mare stood patiently nearby, watching him with those knowing eyes. His water jug was nearly empty, and he knew his chances of survival alone were slim. But following wild horses, it seemed impossible, especially with his weakness. The mare made a soft sound, somewhere between a nicker and a call. She took 3 steps away, then turned back to look at him. The message was clear. He could come with them. The choice was his. No judgment, no demands. Just an offer of companionship and perhaps survival. Amir looked down at the horsehair bracelet around his wrist, then back at the mare. His legs were shaking from exhaustion, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for the first time since the fever had changed his life, he felt something more powerful than fear or shame. He felt possibility. With trembling fingers, he emptied his remaining water into a small hollow in the rocks, a gift back to the desert that had led him to this moment. Then, gathering what little strength remained in his tired body, he took his first steps toward his new family. The mare waited patiently, and when he reached her side, she merely turned and began walking, matching her pace to his uncertain steps. Behind them, the herd moved like a protective wave, their bodies shielding him from the worst of the wind. Above, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Amir thought of his grandmother's stories again, understanding for the first time that perhaps they weren't just stories after all. Sometimes the desert did more than take. Sometimes, if you were brave enough to listen, it showed you a new way to belong. Dawn found Amir, curled between 2 young mares, their bodies sheltering him from the night's chill. His fingers clutched a small pouch of dried desert herbs he'd gathered under the herd's guidance, plants that even his grandmother hadn't known about. The horses had shown him which ones to pick, carefully nudging his hands towards certain stems and away from others. Learning to read the herd's language was like discovering a new way to see. Each ear flick, tail swish, and subtle shift of weight carried meaning. The lead mare, whom he'd begun to think of as Saida, the Arabic word for lady, was his most patient teacher. She would stand beside him for hours, demonstrating how to test the wind for water signs, how to read the desert's subtle changes. When his trembling hands made it difficult to gather herbs, she would lower her head to steady his arms against her neck. Other horses in the herd developed their own ways of helping. A young stallion with a white star on his forehead would deliberately place his hooves in safe paths, showing Amir where the ground was firmest. The dappled foal who'd first bumped into him now stayed constantly at his side, offering support. When his legs grew tired, the herd moved in patterns Amir gradually began to understand. They followed ancient paths known only to them, traveling in the cool hours and resting when the sun was highest. During these rest periods, Amir watched the complex social dynamics unfold. There was a hierarchy, but not like the rigid structure of his former village. Here, leadership was fluid, based on wisdom and ability rather than tradition alone. His tremor became less of a hindrance as he learned to work with it rather than fight it. The slight shake in his hands made him extraordinarily sensitive to vibrations in the ground. He could feel approaching storms or predators before even the horses noticed them. What his village had seen as weakness became a different kind of strength. Each day brought new discoveries. He learned that certain flowers bloomed just before rain, that particular birds appeared when water was near the surface. The horses showed him how to dig shallow wells in seemingly dry stream beds, their hooves revealing moisture just below the surface. He discovered that his stutter disappeared completely when he mimicked the soft whistling sounds the mares used to call their foals. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Saida led him to a hidden canyon. There, clinging to the shadows of the rock walls, grew plants he'd never seen before, desert herbs with healing properties. She watched carefully as his shaking hands gathered the precious leaves, and for the first time, he understood that the herd wasn't just helping him survive, they were teaching him to thrive. That evening, as the herd settled for the night, Amir sat treating a young mare's scratched leg with a poultice made from his gathered herbs. His hands still trembled, but now they moved with purpose, with knowledge. The mare stood perfectly still, trusting him completely. Around them, the other horses grazed peacefully, their bodies forming a protective circle that was becoming as familiar as his old village's walls. Looking up at the star-filled sky, Amir realized something that brought tears to his eyes. He hadn't stuttered once all day. More than that, he hadn't thought about his disabilities at all. Here, among the horses, his differences weren't flaws to be corrected or burdens to be endured. They were simply part of who he was, no more remarkable than the different colors and patterns in the horses' coats. As if reading his thoughts, Saida came to stand beside him. In the growing darkness, her grey coat seemed to shimmer with starlight. She gently bumped his shoulder with her nose, a gesture he now recognized as affection. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, but for now, this was enough. He had found not just teachers, but a family who accepted him exactly as he was. The wolf appeared at twilight. Amir felt its presence before he saw it, a subtle tremor in the ground that his sensitive hands detected through the sand. At first he thought it was just another small desert tremor, but something about the rhythm was different, predatory. His head snapped up, scanning the gathering darkness. There, a shadow moving against shadows, sleek and purposeful. Not just one wolf, but three. They were targeting the smallest foal, who had strayed slightly from the group. The herd hadn't noticed yet. The wind was blowing in the wrong direction, carrying their scent away from the horses' keen noses. Amir's hands shook violently as fear coursed through him, but the tremors told him exactly where each wolf was positioning itself. Without thinking, he whistled the sharp warning call he'd learned from the mares. The herd responded instantly, the adults forming a protective circle around the young while Saida moved to challenge the threat. But the wolves had hunted horses before. They split up, trying to break the herd's formation. One wolf darted forward, snapping at a mare's legs. Another circled wide, looking for an opening. The third, the largest, kept the herd's attention while its packmates maneuvered. Time seemed to slow. Amir could feel every vibration through the sand, each wolf's footfall, each nervous stamp of the horse's hooves. His stutter disappeared as he began calling out directions to the herd in their own language, a mixture of whistles and soft nickering sounds. "Left flank open! Danger behind!" The horses responded to his calls, shifting their formation to meet each threat. He wasn't just warning them, he was helping coordinate their defense. His trembling hands became an early warning system, feeling the wolves' movements through the ground moments before each attack. The battle reached its peak when the largest wolf lunged for a gap in the defense. But Amir had felt its weight shift before the spring. His warning cry came just in time. Saida's hooves struck out with devastating precision, catching the wolf in mid-leap. The impact sent it tumbling across the sand. The injured wolf scrambled to its feet, but the damage was done. The pack's coordinated attack had failed. After a tense moment, they slunk away into the darkness, leaving behind only footprints and a single bloodied fang that had been knocked loose by Saida's strike. When the danger had passed, Amir's legs gave out and he sank to the sand, his whole body shaking with delayed fear and adrenaline. But as he sat there, catching his breath, he realized something extraordinary had happened. The herd gathered around him, not just to protect, but to acknowledge. Saida approached and dropped the wolf's fang at his feet, a trophy, a symbol. With trembling fingers, he picked up the fang and carefully tied it to his horsehair bracelet. The young foal he'd helped save came to nuzzle his shoulder, and soon he was surrounded by soft noses and gentle nickering sounds of approval. They weren't just thanking him, they were accepting him in a new way. That night, as the herd settled into a protective formation for sleep, Amir's position had subtly changed. He was no longer just being protected. He had become one of the protectors. His hands still shook, his words still sometimes stumbled, but neither mattered. What mattered was that when danger came, he had found his own way to fight. Days blended into weeks as Amir learned to read the desert's ancient language. Each morning, he marked their path with carefully placed stones, creating a map that only he and the herd could understand. Dark stones for water sources, white ones for safe passage, red ones for danger. His trembling hands arranged them with deliberate care, each placement a promise to future travelers. Saida watched his growing expertise with quiet approval. She had begun teaching him more complex aspects of herd leadership, how to choose the safest routes through treacherous terrain, how to sense approaching weather changes before they became dangerous. The other horses now looked to him almost as much as they did to her, especially when his sensitive hands detected distant threats through the earth's vibrations. One morning, as dawn painted the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold, Amir noticed something different in the air. The wind carried a peculiar heaviness, and the usually steady vibrations beneath his feet felt somehow muted, as if the sand itself was holding its breath. Saida raised her head at the same moment, her ears swiveling toward the horizon. "Storm," Amir whispered, his voice clear and steady. Not just any storm. This was different from the usual dust devils that danced across the dunes. His hands could feel it in the ground, a distant rumbling that spoke of rare desert rain. If they moved quickly, they could reach the hidden canyon. He'd been saving for such a moment. He whistled the signal to move, and the herd responded immediately. Even the older stallions, usually more independent, fell into formation without hesitation. They trusted his judgment now, just as they trusted Saida's. The young foal, who had become his constant companion, pranced nervously at his side, sensing the changing weather. Leading the herd through the desert's maze of dunes and rock formations required all the knowledge he'd gained. They moved swiftly but carefully, following paths marked by his stone signals from previous explorations. When they reached a particularly challenging passage, Amir's trembling hands actually helped him better sense which routes would support the horse's weight. The canyon, when they reached it, proved perfect for their needs. High walls would protect them from the worst of the wind, while natural hollows in the rock would collect the precious rainwater. As the first heavy drops began to fall, Amir worked quickly with the herd to guide the younger ones to the safest spots. Rain in the desert was both blessing and danger. Too much too quickly could turn dry wadis into deadly floods, but Amir had chosen their shelter well. From their protected position, they could watch the magnificent display of nature's power without fear. Thunder rolled across the sky like celestial hoofbeats, and lightning transformed the desert into a landscape of brilliant shadows and blinding light. During a brief lull in the storm, Amir noticed something remarkable. The horses weren't huddled, in fear of the thunder and lightning. Instead, they seemed to be celebrating the rain in their own way. Young colts pranced in the shallow puddles forming on the canyon floor, while older horses turned their faces up to let the rain wash their coats clean. Saida stood beside him at the canyon's entrance, both of them watching over their family. The wolf's fang on his bracelet clicked softly against a new stone he'd added, a piece of smooth, dark rock that had proven unusually good at conducting ground vibrations. Together, they were building a language of their own, one that combined the wisdom of both their kinds. As the storm began to ease, Amir realized how far he'd come from the useless boy his village had abandoned. His hands still shook, yes, but they now held the power to guide and protect. His voice, once halting and uncertain, now carried commands that could lead 30 horses to safety. The desert hadn't just kept him alive, it had taught him how to live. The wall of sand appeared like a mountain rising from the earth. Amir had never seen anything like it, a roiling mass of orange-black clouds that devoured the horizon. His hands trembled violently against the ground, feeling the storm's approach. Through the sand, this wasn't just wind and dust, this was the desert's fury given form. "Habub," he whispered, remembering his grandmother's stories of the great sandstorms that could swallow entire caravans. The herd grew restless around him, sensing the approaching danger. Even Saida's usual calm seemed tested as she pawed at the ground, her ears pinned back against the rising wind. They needed shelter, and quickly. Amir's mind raced through his mental map of the territory. The canyon that had protected them from the rain was too far. The scattered rock formations nearby wouldn't be enough. Then he remembered, 3 days ago, his hands had detected something unusual in the ground's vibrations, a hollow feeling that suggested underground spaces. He whistled sharply, calling the herd to attention. Time was critical now. The storm was moving faster than any natural wind should, driven by forces he didn't fully understand. Leading 30 horses through unfamiliar territory with a monster at their backs would test everything he'd learned. The first winds hit them like physical blows. Sand stung their eyes and filled the air with a terrifying roar. The younger horses wanted to run, but Amir and Saida kept them together, maintaining formation through a combination of commanding whistles and gentle nudges. His trembling hands, pressed against the neck of the nearest horse, transmitted calm despite his own fear. They moved as one entity through the growing chaos. Amir used his sensitivity to vibration to guide them, feeling his way toward that hollow space he'd detected before. The storm grew worse with each passing moment. The sun vanished, plunging them into an eerie twilight, broken only by occasional static flashes of lightning within the sand clouds. The foals were struggling now, their smaller bodies buffeted by the wind. Without hesitation, the larger horses formed a barrier around them, while Amir and Saida continued leading the way. His eyes were nearly useless in the storm, but his hands told him they were close. The vibrations through the ground were changing, becoming more resonant. Then he found it. A dark opening in a low cliff face, barely visible through the swirling sand. The entrance was narrow, but it opened into a larger space beyond. Amir had never been so grateful for his small size as he slipped inside to check the stability. His hands read the rock walls like a book, feeling for dangerous cracks or signs of weakness. The cave was sound and larger than he'd hoped. One by one, he and Saida guided the herd inside. The younger ones first, then the mothers followed by the rest. The storm raged outside like a living thing trying to reach them, but the cave held strong. In the darkness, Amir moved among the horses, checking for injuries. His sensitive fingers found cuts and scrapes from the flying sand, which he treated with herbs from his medicine pouch. The wolf's fang on his bracelet clinked against stone as he worked, a reminder of other dangers they'd faced together. Hours passed. The storm's voice rose and fell like waves against their shelter. The horses remained remarkably calm, trusting in the safety of their refuge. Several of the younger ones even dozed off, their breathing adding a gentle counterpoint to the storm's fury. Amir sat with his back against the cave wall, Saida's solid warmth beside him. In the dark, he could feel the vibrations of the storm. Through the rock, nature's raw power seeking entry, but finding none. His hands shook not from fear now, but from the sheer energy coursing through the earth. A piece of lightning-struck wood he'd collected earlier proved useful as a torch, allowing him to examine their shelter more closely. The cave walls held ancient marks, grooves and scratches that suggested other horses had sheltered here during past storms. They'd found not just safety, but a place with history, a sanctuary used by wild herds perhaps for generations. When the storm finally began to weaken, hours later, Amir understood that they'd passed another milestone together. The desert had tested them with one of its greatest challenges, and they had met it not as separate beings, but as a single family, each member playing their part in their collective survival. In the days following the great storm, something shifted in Amir's relationship with the herd. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They had formed something deeper, a brotherhood written in shared experiences and mutual trust. At a small desert pool they'd discovered together, Amir watched his reflection ripple beside those of the horses, and for the first time he saw no difference between them. He'd learned to read each horse's unique personality as clearly as he once read footprints. In the sand, there was Ree, the young stallion with the star marking, whose playful spirit masked a fierce protective instinct. Layla, the dappled mare who always seemed to know when Amir's legs were tiring and would position herself perfectly for him to lean against. And Fajar, the dawn-colored foal who had appointed himself Amir's personal guardian, never straying far from his side. But it was his connection with Saida that had grown the most profound. They communicated now with barely a gesture, a flick of her ear, a tremor in his hand, the slightest shift in breathing. She knew when his thoughts drifted to his old village and would gently bump his shoulder, bringing him back to the present. He, in turn, could sense when she was concerned about the herd's safety, often feeling the danger through the ground before she spotted it. Together, they developed a new way of organizing the herd's daily routines. Amir's understanding of desert plants combined with the horse's instincts created more efficient grazing patterns. His ability to detect subtle changes in ground vibration helped them find water more reliably. Even his stutter, which sometimes still emerged when he was excited, became part of their shared language. The horses learned to recognize certain repeated sounds as specific warnings or directions. The herd's social structure evolved to accommodate their unique partnership. While Saida remained the lead mare, Amir became something entirely new, not quite horse, not quite human, but a bridge between worlds. The younger horses especially seemed to gravitate toward this arrangement, often coming to him for guidance. Before checking with the older horses, One afternoon, as they rested in the shade of a rock formation, Amir noticed something remarkable. The herd had arranged itself in a new formation, with him and Saida at its heart rather than its edge. The older horses had created a perfect circle around a small water pool, each taking turns to drink while maintaining the formation. It wasn't just protection. It was inclusion at the deepest level. That evening, as the sun painted the desert gold, Amir sat weaving new patterns into his horsehair bracelet. Each strand told a story now. The wolf's fang from their first battle. Strands from horses who had become family, small tokens from their shared adventures. His hands still shook as he worked, but the tremors had become as much a part of him as his heartbeat. No longer a flaw, but simply a feature of who he was. Fajar lay beside him, head resting trustingly against his leg, while Saida stood watch. Nearby, the rest of the herd grazed peacefully, their movements creating a gentle symphony of sounds that Amir now understood as clearly as spoken words. This was what his grandmother had meant about the desert's gifts. Not just survival, but transformation. Not just a new life, but a new way of being. The rival herd appeared at the only water source for miles around. Amir felt their approach through the ground long before they came into view, the vibrations of many hooves moving with aggressive purpose. Beside him, Saida lifted her head, her ears pivoting forward as dust clouds rose on the horizon. They had only discovered this oasis yesterday, a precious pool fed by underground springs, surrounded by enough grazing to sustain them for days. But the approaching herd was larger than theirs, nearly 50 strong, led by a massive black stallion whose battle scars gleamed silver in the morning light. Amir's hands trembled against Fajar's neck as he assessed the situation. Their herd could run, find another water source, but the nearest one was 2 days' journey away, and 3 of their mares were heavy with foal. They needed this water. His fingers found the wolf's fang on his bracelet, remembering other challenges they'd faced together. The rival herd's leader approached with the confidence of one used to taking what he wanted. His band spread out behind him in an intimidating display of force, but Amir noticed something in their formation, gaps, inconsistencies. They were many, yes, but they moved as individuals, not as a family. Without waiting for the stallion to make his move, Amir stepped forward. His legs shook slightly, but his voice, when it came, was clear and strong. He whistled the herd's gathering, a call, a sound that had evolved from months of communication with his family. His herd responded instantly, moving into a formation they'd perfected during the sandstorm. The youngest and most vulnerable at the center, surrounded by concentric circles of protection. But this wasn't just a defensive posture. It was a demonstration of their unity. Every horse knew their place, moved with purpose, trusted in each other. The rival stallion faltered for a moment, confused by this display. He'd expected either immediate surrender or a traditional challenge from another stallion. Instead, he faced something he'd never seen before. A human boy and a grey mare moving as one, leading a herd that behaved like a single organism. Amir felt a scar on his palm stretch as he made the next series of signals. On his command, the herd began to move in a complex pattern he'd discovered they could execute perfectly. It looked like a dance, but served to demonstrate their control of the space around the water source. His sensitivity to vibration helped him coordinate their movements with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The rival herd's formation began to waver. Some of the younger horses at its edges were already drifting closer, fascinated by the display of coordination and community. They were witnessing. The black stallion stamped and snorted, trying to maintain his authority, but the power dynamic had shifted. Then Amir did something unexpected. He walked slowly to the water's edge and knelt, cupping his shaking hands to drink. Behind him, his herd maintained their formation, protecting him while he made himself vulnerable. It was a gesture that said more than any show of force could. This was their water, They belonged here, and they were unafraid. After a tense moment, Saida moved to stand beside him, then Fajar, then others, each approaching the water with calm confidence while maintaining their protective formation. The message was clear. They would share this resource, but they would not be driven away. The rival stallion's next move would become part of the desert's legend. Slowly, regally, he lowered his head, not in submission but in recognition. His herd, sensing the change, began to relax. Some of the younger ones even attempted to mirror the disciplined movements they'd witnessed. That evening, both herds shared the oasis. The rival stallion's band began to learn from Amir's family, seeing the advantages of their coordinated approach to survival. The black stallion himself spent long moments observing how Amir and Saida worked together, perhaps recognizing that true strength lay in unity rather than dominance. The scar this encounter left on Amir wasn't physical. It was a mark of growth, of understanding that leadership wasn't about size or force. It was about creating something worth following. His trembling hands had become symbols not of weakness, but of a different kind of power. The power to bring together, to guide, to transform. Dawn painted the sky in shades of hope when Amir's trembling hands first detected the underground water. The vibrations were different here, deeper, more resonant, suggesting something vast beneath the surface. A rare desert flower, its petals, the color of sunset, grew in a pattern he'd never seen before, forming a natural arrow pointing toward a narrow canyon. Saida noticed his excitement and moved closer, her ears pricked forward with interest. The rest of the herd, including several members of the former rival band who had chosen to stay with them, gathered around. Even the black stallion, who they now called Malik, seemed to sense the importance of the moment. The canyon entrance was easy to miss, a thin crack in the rock face that seemed to lead nowhere. But Amir had learned to trust the desert's subtle signs. He whistled softly, signaling for the herd to follow in single file. His hands brushed the canyon walls as they walked, reading the stone like a familiar text. The passage twisted and turned, each bend revealing new wonders. Desert vines with edible berries clung to the rocks, small pools of crystal-clear water collected in natural basins. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying a sweetness that spoke of hidden life. Then the canyon opened up, and Amir's breath caught in his throat. Before them lay a hidden valley, protected on all sides by towering cliffs. A series of springs bubbled up from the ground, creating a network of small streams that nourished a paradise of desert plants. Some he recognized from his grandmother's teachings, others were entirely new to him, but what made this place truly extraordinary was its defensibility. The single, narrow entrance made it easy to protect, while the high cliffs would shelter them from sandstorms. The springs guaranteed a permanent water source, and the variety of plants meant year-round grazing. They had found more than just an oasis. They had found a home. Over the next few days, Amir and the herd explored every corner of their new territory. His sensitivity to ground vibrations helped him map the underground water system, understanding how the springs connected and flowed. He discovered places where the rock walls formed natural shelters, perfect for protecting newborn foals or sheltering during extreme weather. Working with Saida and Malik, he began establishing routes and routines that would prevent overgrazing. The horses learned to rotate between different areas, allowing plants time to recover. Amir's knowledge of desert herbs expanded as he discovered new species. Some with healing properties he carefully documented by arranging small stones in patterns that told their stories. The valley transformed them all. The younger horses grew stronger, benefiting from the reliable water and varied diet. The pregnant mares found safe places to rest, their anxiety easing in the protected environment. Even the most independent horses began to understand the value of community, contributing to the system of lookouts and signals that kept them all safe. One evening, as Amir sat weaving a new kind of carrier for his healing herbs, he found a flower unlike any he'd seen before. Its petals seemed to glow in the dying light, and its scent reminded him of his grandmother's stories about desert magic. He carefully preserved it, adding it to his collection of precious finds, a symbol of the desert's endless capacity to surprise and provide. The valley wasn't just changing the herd, it was changing him too. His tremors became even more useful as he learned to read the subtle differences in underground water flows. His stutter disappeared completely as he developed new whistles and calls to coordinate the herd's movements through their territory. What his old village had seen as weaknesses had become the foundation of his strength. As the sun set behind the cliffs, casting long shadows across their sanctuary, Amir realized that his grandmother had been right all along. The desert never just took, it gave as well to those who learned to listen and understand. They had found more than just water and shelter here. They had found a place where differences were strengths, where cooperation meant survival, and where a boy once branded as useless could become exactly who he was meant to be. The sound of the village bell carried across the desert, stopping Amir in his tracks. He knew that tone. 3 rings, pause, 2 rings, the signal for approaching traders. His hands trembled against Saida's neck, but not from fear. Through the ground, he could feel the vibrations of many feet and laden animals moving toward their valley's outer boundaries. He didn't need to see them to know who they were. His former village's trading caravan always took this route during the late summer season. But this time, instead of being the abandoned child they'd left behind, he was the guardian of the only reliable water source for miles. Saida sensed his tension and nickered softly. Around them, the herd moved into their protective formation. Without needing commands, even Malik, the black stallion, positioned himself strategically, understanding the importance of this moment. They had all grown into something remarkable together, not just a herd, but a community that protected its own. The caravan appeared through the heat haze, looking smaller than Amir remembered. He recognized his father's distinctive limp, his older brother's red headscarf, faces that had once meant everything to him. They halted abruptly at the sight of the massive herd arranged before them, with a boy at its center who looked both familiar and strange. "Water!" his father called out, his voice carrying the desperate edge of those who had traveled too long without it. "We would trade for water." Amir felt the weight of the moment in his chest. He could turn them away, as they had turned him away. His hands brushed against the wolf's fang on his bracelet, remembering all that had happened since they'd left him to die. But the desert had taught him better lessons than revenge. He stepped forward, Saida moving with him like a shadow. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong, without a trace of his old stutter. "The water is free to all who respect it, and those who share it." The recognition in his father's eyes was like watching ice crack under the sun. His mother pushed forward through the crowd, her hand covering her mouth. His sister reached out, as if to touch him, then drew back, uncertain. Amir whistled and the herd parted, creating a path to the nearest spring. He had prepared for this moment without knowing it, setting up a watering station where humans and horses could drink without disturbing each other. As he guided the caravan through his domain, he pointed out the signs and markers he'd created. Which plants were safe to eat, which could heal, which warned of danger. His brother stared at him with disbelief as he demonstrated how to read the stone patterns that told of water depth and safety. The other traders whispered among themselves, watching him move among the horses as if he were one of them. But it was his father's silence that spoke loudest. When everyone had drunk their fill and refilled their water skins, Amir's father approached him alone. The proud man he remembered seemed somehow diminished, aged by more than just the passing, the seasons. We believed we were being merciful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A quick death instead of a slow one. We were wrong." Amir looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw not the terrifying figure of his childhood, but a man who had made choices based on fear and limited understanding. The desert had taught him that true strength lay in forgiveness, not in holding on to past hurts. The desert gives as much as it takes, Amir said, echoing his grandmother's words. But you have to learn to listen. He reached into his herb pouch and pulled out several precious seeds from the valley's rare plants. Plant these near the village well. They'll show you when the water table is high enough to dig. His mother began to cry, the sound carrying strangely. In the desert air, his sister moved forward and this time didn't stop, throwing her arms around him. He hugged her back, feeling the years of separation dissolve like morning mist under the sun. As the caravan prepared to leave, loaded now with water and knowledge instead of just goods for trade, Amir watched them with new eyes. He had feared this moment for so long, but now he understood. He hadn't just survived their abandonment, he had grown beyond it. The boy they had left behind no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had learned the desert's deepest lesson, that from the harshest circumstances could come the greatest gifts. Word spread across the desert like wind-blown seeds, stories of a boy who spoke the language of horses, who could read water in the earth, who welcomed travelers with wisdom instead of weapons. They came first in ones and twos, outcasts, wanderers, those who had been branded as different by their own people. Amir recognized himself in each of them. The girl with a twisted foot who could predict storms by the ache in her bones. The old man cast out for his failing eyesight who could identify hundreds of plants by touch and smell. The young boy who couldn't speak but could whistle like a desert bird. Each brought their own gifts, their own ways of reading the world. In the cool shadows of the canyon walls, Amir began teaching what he had learned. His hands, still trembling, guided others to feel the vibrations in the earth. He showed them how to arrange stones to mark safe paths, how to recognize the signs of underground water, how to work with the horses instead of trying to dominate them. The cave walls became their library. Using natural pigments, they recorded their growing knowledge in pictures and symbols. Amir's original stone patterns evolved into a more complex language, one that could tell stories of seasonal changes, migration routes, and the healing properties of plants. The horses watched these lessons with interest, sometimes adding their own knowledge by leading students to new discoveries. Saida proved to be as gifted a teacher as Amir. She showed remarkable patience with newcomers, demonstrating again and again how to approach horses with respect rather than fear. Malik, too, played his part, teaching through example how strength could be used to protect rather than intimidate. Some days, Amir would lead his students into the desert, showing them how to read the landscape as his grandmother had once taught him. The desert, he would tell them, speaks in many voices. Some hear it in the wind, others in the movement of sand. Some, like me, feel it through their hands, but everyone can learn to listen. The herd grew not just in numbers, but in purpose. Horses that had once been rivals became teachers themselves, helping newcomers understand the complex social dynamics of the herd. Young foals born in the valley grew up knowing both human and horse ways, creating a new kind of community. One evening, as Amir added new marks to their cave wall chronicle, he found himself teaching a young girl how to mix healing poultices. Her hands shook like his, and tears of frustration rolled down her face as she struggled to hold the grinding stone steady. But when he showed her how to use the tremors to better mix the herbs, her eyes lit up with understanding. "In my village," she said, "they called this a curse." She held up her trembling hands. "But here," Amir finished for her, "we know better. Every difference is a gift if you learn how to use it." That night, as the stars emerged above the valley, Amir sat with Saida and watched their expanded family. Humans and horses shared the space naturally now, each respecting the other's ways. The cave walls glowed faintly with their recorded wisdom, a growing testament to what was possible when people looked past surface differences to see the gifts beneath. His grandmother's stories had come full circle. She had taught him that the desert gives as much as it takes, but now he understood an even deeper truth, that sometimes what seems like the desert's greatest challenge is actually its most precious gift. His trembling hands, once a source of shame, had led him to this moment, to this place, to this purpose. The drought came like a slow-burning fire, consuming the desert one day at a time. Amir first felt it through his hands, subtle changes in the ground's vibrations as the underground water levels began to drop. The drought-cracked earth told a story of approaching crisis that only he could read. Each morning, he checked the springs that fed their valley. Each morning, they ran a little lower. The rare desert flowers that had become their calendar were blooming too early, too desperately. Even the hardy desert plants began to curl in on themselves, hoarding what little moisture remained in their stems. Saida sensed his concern, her usual calm demeanor showing signs of worry as she watched him make his daily rounds. The rest of the herd grew restless, instincts warning them of the coming hardship. The humans in their community too began to show signs of strain, watching the sky for clouds that refused to appear. But this time, they weren't facing the crisis alone. Years of learning to work together had prepared them for this moment. Amir gathered everyone, human and horse alike, in the main canyon. His hands trembled as he drew patterns in the sand, but his voice was steady as he explained what needed to be done. The young girl with the storm-sensing feet helped identify which parts of the valley would dry up first. The old man, with his knowledge of plants, showed them which ones could be harvested and stored without killing the roots. The silent boy who could whistle like birds became their early warning system for approaching dust storms. Working together, they began implementing emergency measures they'd prepared but never had to use. Deeper wells were dug in locations Amir had marked during better times. The horses, understanding the gravity of the situation, organized themselves into teams, using their strength to help move earth and rock where needed. But their greatest challenge came when other groups began arriving at the valley, drawn by rumors of their water source. Desperate people with thirsty animals, their own water sources having dried up completely. The valley's resources were already strained. Turning them away meant condemning them to death, but accepting them all might doom everyone. Amir spent a night in deep thought, his hands pressed against the earth, feeling the remaining water flowing beneath them. The next morning, he gathered the community again. "The desert," he said, "taught me that survival isn't about hoarding resources. It's about sharing knowledge." Instead of simply providing water, they began teaching the newcomers everything they'd learned: how to read the signs of underground water, how to harvest moisture from certain plants without destroying them, how to work with horses to cover more ground in the search for resources. The drought worsened, but their community grew stronger. Every new arrival brought their own knowledge, their own skills. A trader taught them how to create better water storage systems. A wandering shepherd showed them new ways to find water-rich plants. Even the children contributed, their keen eyes spotting signs the adults might miss. Through it all, the horses remained their partners and protectors. Malik led scouting parties to search for new water sources. Saida seemed to know instinctively which humans needed the most encouragement, staying close to those struggling with fear or despair. The foals born in their valley demonstrated remarkable adaptability, learning to survive on less while maintaining their spirits. When the rains finally returned months later, they were no longer the same community that had entered the drought. They had become something more. A living example of how crisis could unite rather than divide, how differences could become strengths, how the desert's harshest trials could bring out the best in both humans and horses. The first markers appeared like stone flowers blooming across the desert, simple arrangements of rocks that told stories of safe passages, water sources, and shelter from storms. Amir had taught his community to create them, but now others were. learning to read and add to them, spreading a new language across the sands. Trading caravans began adjusting their routes to pass by the valley, not just for water, but for knowledge. Each visit brought new exchanges, not of goods, but of wisdom. Amir's hands still trembled as he demonstrated how to feel the earth's vibrations, but now he understood that his tremors allowed him to teach this skill in a way others could grasp. Saida had become as much an ambassador as a leader. She seemed to instinctively know which horses from passing herds might be interested in their way of life. Some chose to stay, while others carried what they'd learned to distant parts of the desert. The network grew, marked by trails of understanding, rather than boundaries of separation. One morning, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, moving in the disciplined formation of desert patrol guards. Amir felt their approach through the ground, not as potential threats, but as an opportunity. These were the same guards who once would have chased wild horses away from water sources. Now they came seeking guidance. "We've seen your markers," their leader said, weathered face showing both respect and curiosity. "We've heard stories of how you work with the horses, how you read the desert. Our commanders want to establish regular patrols through these regions, but we need help understanding your methods." Amir looked to Saida, who had already moved to greet the patrol horses with diplomatic grace. The animals sensed something different here, humans and horses working as equals, not master and mount. Their riders noticed their horses' unusual behavior, the way they seemed drawn to this new way of being. Over the next few days, Amir and his community shared their knowledge. They taught the guards their stone marker system, showed them how to recognize signs of underground water, demonstrated how working with horses as partners made both species stronger. The patrol horses began mimicking the behavior of Amir's herd, showing their riders new ways of moving through the desert. But the most powerful lesson came unexpectedly. A young guard, watching Amir work with a group of children, asked about his trembling hands. Before Amir could respond, the young girl with storm-sensing feet spoke up. "Here, we don't hide our differences," she said proudly. "We use them to help others." The guard removed his glove, revealing fingers that had been badly burned in a fire. "They told me I couldn't be a guard anymore," he said quietly, "but I refused to quit. Still, some tasks are difficult." Amir spent the afternoon showing him how to use his damaged hands' heightened sensitivity to read the weather, just as Amir used his tremors to read the earth. The man's eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but of recognition. He had found a place where his injury could be more than just a handicap. As the guards prepared to leave, they helped establish the first formal safe routes through the desert, marked with their official approval. These paths would connect various communities, water sources and trading posts, creating a network of cooperation rather than competition. That evening, as Amir added new symbols to their cave wall chronicle, he reflected on how far they'd come. The very things that had once marked them as outcasts, trembling hands, twisted feet, silent tongues, scarred bodies, had become the foundation of a new way of living. Their differences hadn't just been accepted, they had become the bridges that connected them to others. Saida pressed her nose gently against his shoulder, and he felt the familiar surge of understanding between them. The desert hadn't changed. It was still as challenging and unforgiving as ever, but they had changed how people faced those challenges. Not alone, not divided by their differences, but united in their diversity, each contribution vital to their shared survival. The storyteller arrived at dusk, her staff decorated with ribbons that told the tales she'd collected. She wasn't the first to come seeking their story, but something about her was different. Her eyes held the same kind of wisdom Amir remembered. In his grandmother's blind gaze, the ability to see beyond surface appearances to deeper truths. "I've followed your markers across 3 territories," she said, settling by their evening fire. "But the real markers are the changes I've seen in the communities I've visited. Villages that once cast out their imperfect members now seek them out as advisors. Herds of horses running free but working alongside humans. Desert paths marked with signs that even children can read. Amir sat beside her, his hands steady as he poured tea into carved wooden cups. Around them, the evening routine of their community unfolded like a familiar dance. Horses and humans moved together in practiced harmony, each contributing to their shared life in their own way. The storyteller watched it all, her face reflecting wonder at the sight of a young girl with a twisted foot leading a group of horses to water, her unusual gait actually helping her navigate the rocky path better than anyone else could. Nearby, the silent boy used his bird whistles to signal the end of the day's activities, the sounds carrying clear messages to both horses and humans. "Tell me," she said, "how it began. Not just the facts. I've heard those. Tell me the heart of it. The moment when you realized that what others saw as weakness was actually strength." Amir's fingers found the wolf's fang on his bracelet, worn smooth by years of touching. As he spoke, others gathered around, adding their own pieces to the tale. Each person's story revealed the same truth, that their supposed flaws had led them to develop extraordinary gifts. The storyteller's staff moved across the sand as she listened, recording their words in her own secret language. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "You've done more than build a community," she said. "You've created a new way of measuring worth. In a land where strength was once measured by how much one could take, you've shown that true power lies in how much one can give." Word of their success had already spread far, carried by traders and travelers. But the storyteller's arrival marked something different. She would share their tale not just as a story of survival, but as a lesson in how to build a better world. More visitors began arriving, not just seeking help, but offering their own unique contributions. A man who had lost an arm became their best one-handed rope maker, developing techniques that others now sought to learn. A woman whose joints caused her constant pain discovered she could predict sandstorms days in advance, her body reading the weather like a living barometer. The horses, too, became part of the legend. Stories spread of how they chose to stay with humans who treated them as equals, how they taught their wild cousins new ways of surviving the desert's challenges. Saida and Malik became known as the founders of a new kind of herd, one that proved cooperation was stronger than competition. Even the desert itself seemed to play a role in their legend. The valley flourished under their care, its hidden springs and rare plants becoming symbols of how harsh environments could nurture extraordinary gifts. Their cave walls, covered now with years of accumulated wisdom, attracted scholars and seekers from distant lands. But perhaps the most powerful part of their legend was how it changed the way communities treated their most vulnerable members. Villagers that heard their story began to look at their own people differently, recognizing that diversity made them stronger, not weaker. Amir understood that their story had become something larger than themselves. It had become a kind of mirror, showing others what was possible when people looked past traditional ideas of strength and worth. His trembling hands had drawn the first marks of this new understanding, but now countless others were adding their own signatures to the tale. The message came with the dawn wind, 3 short whistles, 2 long, the desert's new warning call. Amir's hands felt the vibrations of approaching riders long before they appeared. Their urgent pace told him something was wrong even before they spoke. "Your old village," the lead rider gasped, exhausted from hard riding. "Their well has failed. The backup springs are dry. They have perhaps 3 days of water left, and there are children." Amir didn't need to hear more. His fingers found Saida's mane, and she understood immediately. Around them the herd began to gather, sensing the importance of the moment. Even as his mind raced through calculations of distance and water needs, His body remembered every step of the path to his birthplace. He chose his team quickly, the strongest horses, the most experienced waterfinders, and those whose unique gifts might prove useful. The girl who could sense storms insisted on coming, her twisted foot no barrier to her riding ability. The silent boy with his bird calls would be essential for long-distance communication. As they prepared to leave, Malik stepped forward, offering his strength for the journey. The black stallion had come far from the aggressive leader he'd once been, now understanding that true power lay in protecting others. Together, they formed a group that represented everything their community had become, different abilities united in common purpose. The journey was brutal. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as they raced across the desert, following the most direct route that only Amir's intimate knowledge of the landscape could provide. His trembling hands read the earth constantly, searching for signs of underground, water that might help them along the way. They crested the final dune as the sun began to set, and Amir's heart clenched at the sight of his old home. The village looked smaller than he remembered, its edges brittle with desperation. The once proud well at its center stood dry and useless, its ropes hanging limp. His father was the first to spot them, standing frozen at the village's edge as the unusual caravan approached. Other faces appeared, some familiar, some new, all marked with the fear of people who knew they were running out of time. But Amir wasn't the same boy they had cast out. He sat tall on Saeed's back, his hands steady despite their tremors as he raised them in greeting. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had learned to turn pain into wisdom. "The water still flows," he announced, "but deep beneath the surface. You've been digging in the wrong places." Over the next hours, he demonstrated what the desert had taught him. His sensitive hands mapped the underground water channels, showing them where the well should have been placed. The girl who read storms in her bones warned them about flow patterns they'd never considered. The silent boy's bird calls coordinated. The efforts of humans and horses working together to dig a new well. As water finally burst forth from the earth, Amir saw tears in his father's eyes. But they weren't tears of shame or regret. They were tears of understanding. The village had cast out what they thought was weakness, only to have it return as strength they desperately needed. The horses worked tirelessly alongside the villagers, showing by example how cooperation could accomplish what force could not. Children who had once mocked difference now watched in awe, as each member of Amir's team contributed their unique gifts to the village's salvation. That evening, as the village celebrated around their new well, Amir's old teacher approached him. "We teach our children to be strong," the old man said, "but we never taught them what strength really means. Will you show us?" Amir looked around at the village that had once rejected him. He saw familiar faces now marked with new wisdom, saw children watching the horses with wonder instead of fear, saw his father speaking earnestly with the girl whose twisted foot had helped save them all. "The desert," he said, echoing his grandmother's words, "teaches us that true strength lies, not in what we can do alone, but in what we can do together. Every difference is a gift if we learn to use it wisely." Years passed like wind over sand, each season adding new layers to their story. Amir stood at the entrance of their valley, a small glass vial of golden sand hanging beside the wolf's fang on his bracelet, his hands still trembling after all. This time, traced patterns in the air as he watched the next generation at work. Children born in the valley grew up knowing no distinction between human and horse, between what others called disability and what they recognized as gift. They learned to read the desert's signs as naturally as they learned to walk, some with limps, some with shakes, some in silence, each finding their own way to contribute. The markers they'd created had evolved into a complex network of communication, stretching across the desert. Traders called them the speaking stones, and their presence had transformed the harsh landscape into a web of connected communities. No one traveled alone anymore. The desert had taught them all that survival meant working together. Saida, her mane now streaked with silver, still moved with the grace that had first captured Amir's heart. She had become more than just a lead mare. She was a living legend, the mother of a new kind of herd. Her descendants carried her wisdom in their blood, creating bonds with humans that went beyond mere partnership. Malik, too, had grown into his role as protector and teacher. The fierce black stallion now spent his days helping young horses understand the delicate balance between strength and gentleness. His own foals inherited his impressive bearing, but displayed a natural inclination toward cooperation rather than competition. The valley itself had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a hidden sanctuary had become a center of learning, where people from across the desert came to study their methods. The cave walls, covered with years of accumulated knowledge, had been supplemented by new teaching spaces where everyone could share their unique perspectives. Amir's original village had become one of their strongest allies, transforming itself into a model for others to follow. Where they once cast out those they deemed weak, they now actively sought out people with different abilities, understanding that diversity made them stronger. The well he had helped them dig had become a gathering place where stories were shared and wisdom passed on. But perhaps the most profound change was in how the desert itself was viewed. No longer just a harsh environment to be endured, it had become a teacher for those willing to listen. Every challenge it presented was an opportunity to learn, every hardship a chance to grow stronger together. On this particular morning, Amir watched a new group arrive at the valley. Among them was a young girl with hands that shook just like his. In another time, another place, she might have been cast out, but here she was greeted with joy, her tremors recognized as a gift that would help her feel the desert's subtle voices. "The earth speaks to us in many ways," he told her, sharing the wisdom that had taken him a lifetime to learn. "Some hear it in the wind, some see it in the clouds, some feel it in their bones. Your hands," he added, showing her his own trembling fingers, "they're not shaking, they're listening." As if to confirm his words, Saida approached them, greeting the girl with the gentle wisdom of years. The young girl's eyes widened as she placed her trembling hands on the mare's neck, feeling for the first time how her sensitivity could become strength. Around them, the daily life of their community continued, horses and humans working together, each contributing their unique gifts to their shared survival. The desert wind carried the sounds of their activity, the silent boy's bird calls directing a group on the far side of the valley, the distinctive gait of the girl with the twisted foot leading a water-finding expedition, the clear voice of a former stutterer teaching others to read the speaking stones. Looking out over all they had built together, Amir understood that their story had become part of the desert itself. Like the rare flowers that bloomed after rain, it proved that the most precious gifts often came from the harshest circumstances. His trembling hands had drawn the first marks of this new understanding, but countless others had added their own signatures to the tale. The desert, as his grandmother had promised, had given as much as it had taken. In its vast, unforgiving embrace, they had found not just survival, but a way to thrive. Their differences, once seen as weaknesses, had become the very things that made their community strong. This was the real treasure of the desert's heart. The understanding that every person, every creature, every unique way of being had its own vital role to play in the great dance of survival.